At school pickup in the rain, my daughter-in-law said, "Don't wave at them." The words were quiet, clipped, spoken as though she didn't want the children to hear. But they struck me harder than if she had shouted. I felt them land in my chest like a cold stone dropped into still water, sending ripples through me I couldn't control. I stood there with my umbrella trembling in my hand, the drizzle already soaking the hem of my coat. The children were running across the wet pavement, backpacks bouncing, little faces lit with the simple joy of the day's release. Instinct carried me forward. I wanted to greet them, to lift my hand, to let them know that Grandma was here, standing in the rain just to see their smiles. But her words pinned me in place. Don't wave. It is hard to describe how such a small sentence can unravel something inside you. For me, it wasn't only the instruction, it was the finality of it, the way she looked at me with her chin slightly raised, as though daring me to resist. In that moment, I felt myself become invisible, not just to her, but to the children I had once cradled in my arms, sung to sleep, and fed spoonfuls of mashed peas. They had been mine, too, in a way only a grandmother can understand. And now I was told not to wave, as though my very presence was an embarrassment. The rain tapped steadily on my umbrella, louder than usual, because my ears were burning with the heat of humiliation. My son was not there, he rarely was at pickups, always busy with work. It was she who held the reins of their daily life, and by extension, mine. She decided when I could visit, how long I could stay, what gifts were appropriate, and now, even whether I could wave. I don't think I had realized until that second just how much ground I had ceded over the years, inch by inch, until I was standing in a puddle, forbidden from so much as lifting my hand. I stepped closer anyway. I wasn't defiant enough to make a scene, but I also wasn't ready to fold completely. The umbrella tilted slightly, shielding the children as they reached us. They didn't notice the tension, of course. Their voices were bright, overlapping, full of the stories of playground games and snack swaps. "Grandma, guess what?" one of them started, eyes shining, but then my daughter-in-law's hand closed gently, firmly, on the child's shoulder. "Let's get moving," she said, ushering them toward the car. I followed behind, slower, clutching the umbrella handle too tightly, my knuckles pale. The parking lot smelled of wet asphalt and exhaust, and my shoes squelched with each step. It should have been nothing, just another dreary school pickup. But it wasn't. It was the day something in me shifted, though I didn't yet know how or into what. When the children were buckled in, I leaned slightly toward the open car door. "Bye, darlings," I said softly. Their voices rose in a cheerful chorus, "Bye, Grandma." But she was already pulling the door shut, cutting off the sound. I stepped back, umbrella still overhead, and watched the taillights glow red against the gray afternoon as they drove away. My reflection trembled in the wet pavement at my feet, blurred and shapeless. On the drive home, I gripped the steering wheel too hard, the heater blowing warm air that felt undeserved against my cold skin. My mind replayed the scene again and again, each time sharper, crueler. Don't wave at them. As if my love were something shameful, something to be hidden. I thought about calling my son, but the thought withered before it fully formed. He would be tired, distracted. He would say something like, "Oh, she didn't mean it that way, Mom." He always smoothed things over, which only left me feeling foolish for even raising them. Instead, I pulled into my driveway and sat there for a long time with the engine ticking. The rain drummed softly on the roof, and I thought of all the times I had stood in the rain waiting for my own children, my hair plastered to my face, my coat soaked through, my heart full because I was needed. Now, I wondered if anyone would ever need me again. That evening, I made tea. I chose my favorite cup, the one with the small chip on the rim that made it imperfect but dear to me. I sat at the kitchen table with my hands curled around the heat and stared at the steam until it faded. I should have eaten something, but food felt heavy in my throat. Instead, I let the house hum quietly around me, the old clock ticking, the refrigerator groaning to life, the faint patter of rain easing off outside. It was in that stillness that the sadness began to settle into something harder. Not anger, not yet. But a kind of reckoning. I thought about how my daughter-in-law had slipped into my life with such ease, how I had made space for her, offered help, given time, stepped back when she wanted to step forward. And how each of those small accommodations had led me here, to being told not to wave. Perhaps she didn't hate me. Perhaps she even thought she was protecting her children from confusion or over-attachment. But the effect was the same. I had become a shadow at the edge of their lives, tolerated but unseen. I wish I could say I cried that night, but I didn't. My tears had been spent long ago, in other small humiliations that had added up to this one. Instead, I sat at the table until my tea cooled and thought about what I had left. My memories. My dignity. My choices, few as they seemed. When I finally rose to go to bed, I paused at the hallway mirror. My reflection looked older than I had expected, lines etched deeper, eyes dimmer. I touched the glass lightly, tracing the outline of my own face. "Don't wave," I whispered, testing the words again. They sounded ridiculous in the empty house, almost absurd. Yet they carried the weight of something final. I turned away, switched off the light, and went to bed with the sound of rain still whispering at the windows. The next morning, the sky was a pale, washed-out gray, as though the rain had stripped the world of its color. I sat at the edge of my bed longer than usual, listening to the faint sound of sparrows in the hedge outside. Their voices carried a kind of insistence, a reminder that life went on regardless of how small or invisible I felt. I pushed myself up, joints stiff, and padded into the kitchen. The kettle hissed as it came to a boil, and I poured water over the tea bag, watching the leaves darken the cup. It was such a familiar ritual, but my hand trembled slightly as I lifted the spoon. I couldn't shake the echo of yesterday. "Don't wave at them." It wasn't just the sentence. It was the way it lingered, attaching itself to everything I did. When I opened the cupboard to reach for bread, I thought of how I had once baked loaves with my grandson on a Saturday morning, his hands clumsy but eager beside mine. When I pulled on my coat to check the post, I remembered how my granddaughter had once twirled in the same hallway, showing me her new school shoes. Every corner of the house whispered their presence, but their presence now belonged to someone else's permission. I tried to busy myself that day. I washed the kitchen floor, kneeling with a cloth until my knees ached. I sorted through the drawer of mismatched cutlery, throwing away the bent spoons. I folded laundry with care, pressing the edges so neat you'd think someone important was coming to inspect them. But no one came. The hours stretched, and the house grew heavier around me. By afternoon, I found myself sitting in the armchair near the window, staring out at the street. A young mother walked past pushing a stroller, her hair damp, her face flushed with the effort. I remembered those days, how endless and exhausting they were, yet how deeply they filled me. I thought of my own son as a boy, his sticky hands reaching for mine, his sleepy head dropping onto my shoulder in the quiet after a tantrum. I had been his safe place then. And now? Now I was told to remain on the sidelines, silent and still. The truth settled over me slowly. I had allowed this. Piece by piece, I had accepted the shrinking of my place in their lives. I had said it's fine when she decided birthday parties would be just for school friends. I had said of course when she suggested they call me less often so the children wouldn't be distracted from homework. I had even smiled politely when she once told me that the kids thought of me more like a distant aunt than a grandmother because I wasn't with them daily. Each time, I had swallowed the hurt, telling myself it was better not to cause trouble. And each time, I had disappeared a little more. But yesterday was different. Yesterday she had put it into words. She had told me not to wave. And in that command, I saw the whole shape of what I had become, a woman erased. That evening, when my son called briefly, his usual rushed check-in, voice tight with fatigue, I almost brought it up. The phone was warm against my ear, and I could hear the faint hum of his office in the background. "How are you, Mom?" he asked, distracted. I opened my mouth, ready to spill it all, how his wife had spoken to me, how small I had felt, how close I was to breaking. But then he sighed heavily and said, "I'm just finishing up here. Long day. How was yours?" And I heard myself say, "Oh, just fine. Quiet." I hated myself for it. I hated the cowardice in that answer. But it was easier than handing him my pain, only for him to smooth it over, to defend her, to tell me I misunderstood. Easier, perhaps, but emptier too. After the call, I sat with the silence pressing against me until I could hardly breathe. Then, without really deciding, I reached for my coat and stepped outside. The air was sharp with damp earth and lingering rain. I walked slowly down the lane, past the row of hedges, past the lamppost that had stood in the same place since my children were small. Each step steadied me, though I had nowhere to go. I ended up at the small park 2 streets over. It was nearly empty at that hour, just a couple of teenagers leaning against the swings, their laughter carried by the breeze. I sat on a bench beneath a tree whose branches dripped with leftover rain. For a while, I simply sat, watching the sky darken toward evening. My thoughts began to quiet, not by choice but by necessity. There's only so long you can rehearse the same wound before it loses its edge. And then, in the hush of that park, I thought of something I hadn't in years, myself. Not as a mother, not as a grandmother, not as someone's help or someone's afterthought. Just myself. Who was I now? Who had I become when all the roles I once filled so fully had been taken from me or diminished? The answer didn't come, but the question lingered, pulsing quietly inside me as I walked home in the dark. The following days unfolded with the same grayness, but I carried that question with me like a stone in my pocket. When I made tea, I asked myself who I was beyond the cup. When I walked to the shops, I asked myself who I was beyond the groceries I carried. I didn't know, and that not knowing felt like both a wound and a door. One afternoon, I found myself drawn to the back of the closet, where an old box of scarves and hats sat forgotten. I pulled it down, sneezing at the dust, and unwrapped a wool scarf I had knitted years ago. The yarn was uneven, a little rough, but it was mine. My hands had made it, loop by loop. I wrapped it around my neck and caught my reflection in the mirror. The scarf was plain, but it felt like a small claim. Something of me. That night, I dreamed of waving, not at the children, not at anyone in particular, but simply lifting my hand into the air as though to say, I am here. The next week, I agreed to meet an old friend for coffee. We hadn't spoken properly in years, both caught up in families and routines. She arrived with her cheeks flushed from the cold, her laughter warm as ever. We talked about ordinary things, aches and medications, the rising cost of groceries, but I found myself laughing, too, the sound surprising in my own throat. For a little while, I wasn't just someone's grandmother waiting at the edges of their lives. I was simply myself, sharing stories, remembering who I had been and might still be. On the walk home, I felt something loosen in me. Not forgiveness, not yet. But space. A sliver of air where before there had only been suffocation. Still, when the next school pickup came around, I hesitated. I drove there out of habit, umbrella in the back seat, but when I parked and saw her car already waiting, my hands tightened on the steering wheel. I considered leaving, sparing myself the possibility of another cut. But then I thought of my grandchildren's faces, the way their eyes lit up when they saw me, and I knew I couldn't vanish completely. I got out, umbrella in hand though the rain was only a mist. The children spilled out of the building, their voices like bells. I stood where I always did, a little apart, and waited. When they spotted me, their faces broke into smiles, and despite myself, my hand twitched upward. I remembered her words, but this time I let my fingers curl into the faintest wave. Not grand, not dramatic, just enough. A gesture small enough that perhaps she wouldn't notice, but large enough that they would. Grandma, they cried, their voices carrying. For a moment, she looked at me sharply, lips pressed thin. But the children were already tugging at her hands, clamoring about their day, and she didn't say anything. I walked back to my car with my umbrella folded, the mist dampening my hair. My wave had been tiny, almost nothing. But to me, it felt like the beginning of something. A crack in the wall I had been placed behind. A reminder that even small gestures mattered. When I got home, I hung the damp umbrella to dry and stood for a long time in the hallway, listening to the quiet. My chest was still tight, but beneath the tightness was a flicker of something else, something like defiance, or maybe simply the memory of myself. And for the first time in a long while, I whispered aloud, "I am here." The next morning began like so many others, quiet, the kettle hissing, the light filtering weakly through the curtains. But something inside me felt different. The small wave I had given at school pickup lingered in me like a secret flame. It hadn't been much. In fact, it had been almost nothing at all. And yet it was mine. It was an action I had chosen, not one dictated to me. For the first time in a long while, I had stepped slightly outside the boundaries that had been built around me. That tiny defiance sat with me at the kitchen table, warmer than the tea between my hands. Still, it didn't erase the wound. The words "don't wave at them" echoed often, especially in quiet moments. They came to me when I folded laundry, when I walked down the garden path, when I watched the evening news. They were like a bruise I kept pressing without meaning to. But now, each time they surfaced, I also remembered the look on my grandchildren's faces when they saw me wave back. Their joy had been unfiltered, unbothered. They hadn't cared for the rules imposed around them. They had simply been glad to see me. That memory gave me something to hold on to. A few days later, I found myself at the market. I walked slowly through the aisles, basket hooked over my arm, the air heavy with the scent of oranges piled high in crates. I picked out a few, feeling their weight, their bright firmness. When the children were little, I used to bring them oranges, peel them into neat segments at the kitchen table, their small fingers reaching eagerly for each piece. That memory nearly stopped me in my tracks, but instead of walking away, I placed a few extra oranges into the basket. Not to bring to them, no, I wasn't allowed those spontaneous gifts anymore, but for myself. To remind myself that sweetness could still belong in my own kitchen. As I paid at the counter, the cashier, a young woman with tired eyes, smiled at me faintly. "I like your scarf," she said. It was the uneven wool one I had pulled from the back of the closet. I felt a flicker of surprise at the compliment, as though I'd forgotten that anyone could notice me outside of the family. "Thank you," I murmured, my hand brushing the yarn. On the walk home, her words replayed in my mind. It wasn't much, just like the wave hadn't been much. But little things mattered more than I had remembered. That evening, I peeled one of the oranges slowly, letting the citrus scent fill the air. The fruit was bright, almost defiant against the gray of the day. I sat at the table, eating it piece by piece, and for the first time in a long while, I felt as though I was nourishing myself rather than simply keeping myself alive. But the reprieve didn't last long. A few days later, my phone rang. It was my daughter-in-law. Her voice was as crisp as always, polite but laced with a certain edge. "We'd like you to come to Emma's recital next week," she said, her tone making it sound less like an invitation and more like an assignment. "But could you just sit in the back? We don't want her distracted." I gripped the phone tighter. Sit in the back. As though I were an intruder, not family. I swallowed hard, feeling the familiar burn of humiliation. "Of course," I said, because that had always been my response. The call ended quickly, and I stood there, phone still in hand, staring at the wall. That night, I lay awake for hours, staring at the ceiling. The thought gnawed at me, why did I always agree? Why did I keep letting myself be diminished? Perhaps I thought I was keeping peace. Perhaps I feared losing even the small scraps of time I was allowed with the children. But at what cost? Each concession left me hollowed out a little more. When the night stretched too long to bear, I rose quietly and went to the kitchen. The house was silent except for the faint hum of the refrigerator. I poured myself a glass of water and stood by the window. The moon hung pale above the rooftops, and in that stillness, I whispered, "No more." It wasn't a plan, not even a promise. Just a fragile declaration to the night. The day of the recital came. I dressed with care, choosing a simple blouse and trousers, brushing my hair until it lay neatly against my shoulders. I tucked the scarf around my neck, the uneven wool a kind of talisman. When I arrived at the school, I saw her immediately, guiding the children inside with her usual briskness. She glanced at me briefly, her eyes cool, then turned away. I felt myself shrinking for a moment, but then I straightened my shoulders and walked in. The auditorium smelled of dust and old wood, the stage lit too brightly. Parents clustered in the front rows, their voices a low murmur of pride. I remembered her words, sit in the back, but when I looked around, the back rows were nearly empty, shadowed, forgotten. Something in me rebelled. I wasn't ready to take center stage, but I couldn't accept being hidden away either. So I chose a seat in the middle. Not front, not back. Just present. When the children filed onto the stage, my granddaughter's eyes scanned the crowd. When she spotted me, her face lit up, and she gave a small wave before launching into her song. I lifted my hand, just slightly, in return. The music filled the room, uneven but heartfelt, and I sat there with tears stinging my eyes. Not of sadness this time, but of belonging. Even if only in that moment. Afterward, as families spilled into the hall, she approached me. My daughter-in-law. Her expression was tight, her voice low. "I thought I asked you to sit in the back," she said. Something in me hardened. For years, I had shrunk, apologized, excused myself. But now, I met her eyes and said quietly, I wanted to see her face. It was such a small sentence. Barely a defense at all. But it was mine. And the look on her face, surprise, perhaps even the faintest flicker of doubt, was worth it. She didn't reply. She simply turned to gather the children, her lips pressed thin. I walked to my car with my heart pounding. My hands trembled on the steering wheel, not from fear but from the adrenaline of having spoken, however softly, for myself. The night air was sharp, and as I drove home, I felt it cut through the years of silence I had wrapped around myself. When I arrived home, I hung up my coat and stood in the quiet hallway. The house smelled faintly of the orange peel I had left in the bin earlier that day. I breathed it in deeply and whispered, I am here, once more. But this time, it didn't sound like a question. It sounded like the beginning of an answer. In the days following the recital, my thoughts replayed the moment I had spoken back. It had been just one sentence, I wanted to see her face, but it echoed in me louder than any argument I'd ever rehearsed in silence. It wasn't grand, it wasn't sharp, but it had been honest. For once, I had not swallowed my words, and I found myself standing a little taller in the solitude of my home because of it. Yet honesty is rarely comfortable. The next time I saw her, my daughter-in-law's voice was clipped, her politeness frosted over with something sharper. She asked how I was, but it was clear she didn't want the answer. She mentioned the children's schedules, their busy lives, and how perhaps visits should be a little more structured from now on. I nodded, feeling again that old instinct to comply, but inside me something resisted. Structured. The word sounded like a gate being locked. When she left, I lingered in the doorway, the silence pressing against me. For years, I had equated silence with peace, keep quiet, keep the waters calm, keep myself from being the cause of any storm. But peace that demanded I erase myself was not peace at all. It was surrender. And I realized, standing there with the doorknob still warm in my hand, that I had surrendered too many times already. That evening, I called my son. It was not easy, my hand trembled slightly as I dialed, knowing how quickly he might dismiss my feelings. But I also knew that if I never spoke, nothing would ever change. When he answered, his voice carried the same weariness as always, layered with the background hum of his long hours. "Hi, Mom. Everything okay?" "I went to the recital," I said. He chuckled lightly. "Yes, Emma told me. She was so happy you were there. Thank you for coming." I hesitated, then pressed on. "She told me to sit in the back. She didn't want me distracting anyone." I didn't. I sat in the middle. And I told her I wanted to see Emma's face. There was a pause on the line. "Mom," he said slowly, "I'm sure she didn't mean it badly." She just worries. She told me not to wave at them, I interrupted, the words sharper than I had planned. Silence stretched, and I realized how long I had carried that unspoken wound. My heart thudded as I added, more quietly, do you know what it feels like, to be told you cannot wave at your own grandchildren? His sigh was heavy, torn between loyalties. Mom. I know this is hard. But she has her way of doing things. She wants consistency. The kids already have a lot going on. And what about me? I asked. My voice shook, but I did not take it back. Do I not matter in this? Do you know what it's like to stand in the rain, right there, and be told to pretend I don't exist? Another pause. Longer this time. At last, he said softly, I didn't know she said that to you. There was no apology in his voice, not yet, but there was recognition. That was something. It wasn't resolution, but it was the faintest crack in the wall that had risen between us. We ended the call with awkward goodbyes, neither of us sure how to bridge the distance, but for the first time in years, I had spoken of my hurt plainly. And that mattered more than I had expected. In the following weeks, I began to move differently through my days. Not boldly, not with the kind of defiance I once imagined confrontation required, but quietly, with small acts of self-acknowledgement. I bought myself a book I had long wanted to read, and I read it slowly, savoring the weight of each page instead of rushing. I visited the library, not just for the books but for the sense of belonging among other seekers of stories. I walked in the park more often, listening to the rhythm of my feet against the path, the sound reminding me that I was still moving forward, still present. One afternoon, while walking past a little shop, I noticed a sketchbook in the window. My breath caught, because I hadn't thought of sketching in decades. As a girl, I used to draw everything, faces, trees, even the tea mugs in front of me. But I had left that behind somewhere between raising children and paying bills. On impulse, I stepped inside and bought it, along with a simple set of pencils. That night, I sat at my table, the paper crisp under my hand, and began to draw the orange that sat in the fruit bowl. It was uneven, clumsy, far from art, but it was mine. And as the lines took shape, I felt a stirring of something I hadn't realized I'd missed, myself as creator, not just caretaker. But healing rarely unfolds without resistance. A week later, I attended another school pickup. I had hesitated, remembering the sting of her words, but the thought of my grandchildren's bright eyes pushed me forward. When I arrived, the drizzle had returned, the air damp and heavy. I stood with my umbrella, watching the children spill out. My heart leapt when they saw me, their smiles wide, their little feet hurrying. And then, her voice, sharp, low, meant only for me. I asked you not to come today. I texted. Didn't you see? I blinked, my phone silent in my pocket. Whether she had or hadn't, the implication was the same, I was intruding, unwelcome. For a moment, my throat tightened with that old, familiar shame. But then I looked at my grandchildren, their hands waving, their mouths already calling Grandma. And I lifted my hand to wave back, full and certain this time. Her face hardened, but the children's joy was louder than her disapproval. They ran to me, wrapping small arms around my waist. I bent down, breathing in the scent of damp hair and soap, and hugged them tightly. In that embrace, I felt both the ache of what was at stake and the certainty of why I couldn't fade away completely. Later, she pulled me aside. You're confusing them, she hissed. They don't need mixed signals. You don't understand how delicate this is. I met her gaze, my voice quiet but steady. They're children. They deserve love, not walls. Her lips pressed into a line, but she said nothing more. For the first time, I didn't shrink. I simply turned and walked away, the children's laughter echoing behind me. That night, when I sat at my kitchen table, I poured tea into my chipped cup and unwrapped another orange. The house was still the same, quiet, solitary, but it felt less like a void and more like a space where I could exist without apology. I opened my sketchbook again, this time drawing the outline of my granddaughter's smile as best I could remember it. The lines were crooked, the likeness imperfect, but the act itself filled me with a quiet sense of dignity. I knew the road ahead would not be easy. My daughter-in-law's resistance was firm, and my son's loyalty would always be split. But I had begun to realize something important: reclaiming myself was not about winning their approval or forcing their permission. It was about refusing to vanish, even if my presence was inconvenient. For years, I had been told, by her, by circumstance, sometimes even by my own son, to take up less space, to speak less loudly, to expect less. But as I sat there sketching with the faint scent of orange lingering on my fingertips, I understood that taking up even a small amount of space was a beginning. And perhaps, I thought as I closed the sketchbook gently, that was enough for now. The morning after that last pickup, I woke with a heaviness in my chest that lingered even as the day unfolded. I moved through my small routines, the kettle hissing, the table set for one, the steady hum of the refrigerator, but everything seemed sharper, as though the edges of my life had been scraped bare. I had held my ground with her, however slightly, and though my words had been few, they had carried a weight I couldn't ignore. For years I had believed that silence kept the peace. But now, silence felt like a wound I had carried too long. And when I thought of my grandchildren, their smiles, their arms flung around me in that damp parking lot, I knew I could not go back to being invisible. They were growing fast, each visit a fleeting piece of time, and I refused to let those years slip through my fingers unmarked. That afternoon, I sat at the kitchen table with a pen and paper. I had not written a letter in years, not properly, not with the intention of being heard. But there was something about the slowness of it, the way ink carried permanence, that felt necessary. I began to write to my son. The words did not come easily, my hand shook as I shaped them. I told him what it felt like to be told not to wave. I told him how small I had felt, how quietly erased. I wrote of standing in the rain, umbrella trembling, watching my grandchildren's joy collide with the walls placed between us. I didn't beg or accuse. I simply described what it felt like to vanish piece by piece. When I finished, the page was uneven with smudges where my hand had hesitated. I folded it carefully, slipped it into an envelope, and left it by the door. For 2 days, the envelope sat untouched. Each time I passed it, my heart wavered. Would he see it as an attack? Would it widen the gap between us? But then I remembered the look on my granddaughter's face at the recital, the way she had waved before singing, unashamed, unafraid. That small, unfiltered love deserved to be honored. So on the 3rd morning, I mailed it. The waiting afterward was heavy. Days stretched. I busied myself with small things, a book, a walk, another sketch in the pad, but beneath it all I carried the weight of what I had revealed. When the phone finally rang, I felt my breath catch before I answered. "Mom," he said. His voice was softer than usual, stripped of its usual rush. "I got your letter." I sat down slowly. "Yes." "I didn't realize," he said, and his words cracked slightly at the edges. "I didn't realize how much this was hurting you." Something loosened in my chest, though I held back tears. "I didn't tell you," I admitted. "I thought, if I stayed quiet, it would keep the peace." But all it did was make me disappear. There was silence on the line, the kind that carries more meaning than words. At last he said, "I'll talk to her." I closed my eyes. I knew it wouldn't be simple, nothing in families ever is, but hearing that from him was more than I had expected. "Thank you," I whispered. That weekend, he brought the children by. It was unplanned, unusual, and my heart fluttered as their laughter filled my small house once more. They scattered into the living room, pulling out the old board games I had kept tucked away. Their voices rose in bright chaos, and I sat there soaking in the sound like sunlight. My son lingered by the doorway, his gaze a mixture of guilt and something gentler, something like recognition. "She means well," he said quietly when the children were too busy to listen. "But she's particular. You know that. I think sometimes she forgets that you and I are, that you raised me." His voice faltered slightly, and he rubbed the back of his neck. "I should have noticed sooner." I nodded, not pressing further. It wasn't full acknowledgement, not yet, but it was more than I had heard in years. And as the children rushed to show me the picture they had drawn, two stick figures holding hands, labeled Grandma and me, I felt something inside me knit itself back together, however imperfectly. But the struggle wasn't over. The next week, at another pickup, she was there again, her eyes cool, her voice measured. "I hear you've been talking," she said. I met her gaze, my scarf wrapped around my neck like armor. "I have," I replied simply. Her lips tightened. For a moment, I expected the sharp words, the dismissal, the gate slamming shut. But instead, she said nothing. She turned to the children, ushered them into the car, and drove away. I stood there in the drizzle, my umbrella open, the mist brushing my face. My heart was pounding, not from fear but from something close to relief. I had not argued, I had not explained, I had simply named my presence. And that, I realized, was enough. That evening, I pulled out my sketchbook again. This time, I drew not fruit or remembered smiles, but my own hand. The wrinkles, the small veins, the shape that had once cradled babies and now turned pages. As I traced each line, I thought of all the times those hands had folded into silence. And I promised myself that from now on, they would not be only instruments of waiting. They would be instruments of saying, of waving, of holding. A few days later, I sat again at the kitchen table, orange peel curling in the bowl, tea steaming at my elbow. The house was quiet, but I no longer felt erased by the silence. I was beginning to see it differently, not as absence, but as space I could fill with my own choosing. A space where I could read, draw, write, or simply exist without apology. And when I whispered again, as I often did now, "I am here," the words no longer sounded fragile. They sounded steady. They sounded like truth. I knew there would be more moments of tension ahead. More clipped voices, more attempts to push me to the edges. But I also knew something deeper now. I was not as easy to erase as I had once believed. And that was the beginning of a freedom I hadn't felt in years. The next time it rained at school pickup, I didn't hesitate. I parked the car, took my umbrella from the back seat, and stepped into the drizzle with a steadiness I hadn't felt in years. The pavement gleamed wet, the air filled with the faint smell of damp leaves. Children poured from the doors, their voices bright against the gray afternoon. And there they were, my grandchildren, running toward the car with their backpacks bouncing. They spotted me instantly. Their faces lit up, and one of them waved. My hand rose before I even thought about it, the umbrella tilting, my palm open in a gesture that once had been forbidden. This time, I did not glance sideways to see if anyone disapproved. I waved, fully and freely, because it was my right to meet their joy with my own. They reached me breathless, voices tumbling over one another, small arms wrapping around my waist. I bent down to hug them, breathing in the scent of rain-soaked hair, and in that moment the years of silence seemed to loosen their grip on me. My daughter-in-law stood a short distance away, her face unreadable. For a second, I braced myself for the words I'd heard before, the instructions, the sharp tone, the quiet erasure. But none came. She simply opened the car door, her expression tight but silent, and let the moment pass. Perhaps she would never truly welcome me. Perhaps she would always see me as an intrusion, a complication. But I had come to accept that I could not control her heart, only my own. And my heart had decided that I would not vanish, no matter how small the space I was given. That night, at home, I sat at my table with a cup of tea and my sketchbook. I turned to a fresh page and began to draw the scene still alive in my mind, two small figures, hands raised, smiling through the rain. My lines were imperfect, clumsy in places, but it didn't matter. What mattered was that I was recording it, not for anyone else, but for me. A moment that no one could take away, a moment that was mine to keep. As the house settled into its usual quiet, I thought about the years ahead. They would not be easy. There would be more friction, more moments of hurt. But I also knew there would be laughter, hugs, drawings pressed into my hands by little fingers, and waves exchanged in the rain. I would no longer trade all of that away for silence. I am no longer the woman who stood frozen with an umbrella trembling in her grip, silenced by a voice that told her she did not belong. I am still her, yes, but I am also more. I am the woman who waves, who speaks softly but truthfully, who claims even the smallest space as her own. When I finished my drawing, I set the pencil down and touched the page lightly. My reflection in the window caught my blind, older, but no longer dim. My voice rose, quiet but firm, filling the empty kitchen. I am here. And this time, the words felt final. Not a plea. Not a fragile whisper. A truth.